Welcome back to Live from Occupy City Hall. My name is Leslie Rolfe. I'm a member of the May 30th Alliance, and today I'm going to give a critique and an analysis about some of the events that went on the night that Michael Sago Jr. was shot and killed by off-duty Winnebago County Sheriff Deputy Frank Pobjecky. In a previous episode, I stated that 2 people were wounded and 1 person was murdered on the night of October 1st, 2011. I just want to amend that and say it is 3 people wounded and 1 person murdered. So that is a mistake for us that was in the pamphlet. I think the next thing I want to take a deep dive into is the usage of the word murder in connection to these officer-involved shootings. And I know that specifically depending on where you stand at when it comes to your support of the police or your support of people who have been shot and killed by the police, where you stand with some of your political beliefs, some of your personal ideological beliefs, it will determine whether or not you view these shootings as murders. When we put the first episode out about the killing of Mark Barmore, the shooting of Mark Barmore, and I entitled it The Murder of Mark Barmore, it was in the midst of doing editing. I didn't really take a deep thought about whether I felt like the word murder was the appropriate word to be using or not. And then it was once I started filming more of these that I found myself wondering, is murder the right term to be using in context to these shootings? But one of the definitions that is given when you look up the word murder is the premeditated killing. And there's a heavy emphasis on the premeditation. And I think that there's an argument that can be made that the training that these police officers go through, the policies that they have, the cycle of violence that persist in the institution is a form of premeditating some of these killings that happen. I believe that police officers give forethought to all the things that they do when they go to these calls, when they pull people over, and that they're thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead based on training that they've retained. And thinking those 2 or 3 steps ahead is a form of premeditation in certain cases. When people are charged with murder one and they try to make the argument that it was a crime of passion or it was something that happened in a moment, there's still people who, the other side makes the argument that even in the moment that you can have premeditation for something. And so I think there's an argument that can be made that these are murders. But I do think that going forward, we will entitle the series The Killing of the Individuals, or The Killing of the Victim, as opposed to the murder of the victim. We have to look at Michael Sago Jr., who is a 16-year-old who didn't have a gun, who didn't make any threats to anybody's life, and view that with empathy when we're learning about what took place and what happened. I think a lot of times what happens is you hear someone is shot by the police or shot by an off-duty police officer, and you wait to form an opinion on what happened or whether they deserve to be shot based on what events come out afterwards. And for a portion of the city and the community, the events that came out afterwards of Michael Sago Jr. being shot and killed was enough to disqualify them from feeling empathy because he was part of a crime taking place, because he was part of a robbery taking place. And there's another portion of the community and the city, a very heavy portion, that predominantly black portion of the city and the community, who knew Michael Sago Jr., who knew Michael Sago Jr.'s family and had connections to him and his family, who didn't care about those things, who understood that, yes, mistakes were made by the young men that went into there and attempted to rob Marie's Pizza. But if they would have been caught after going in there and attempting to rob Marie's Pizza, the results would not have been capital punishment, especially for Michael Sago Jr., who was a minor and who had no weapon, who made no threats. There's a passage within this legal document that states that each person who was shot that night was shot in the back or shot in their back parts. And that is a reoccurring theme throughout these stories that we hear, throughout these events that are in this pamphlet, is people being shot in the back. We talked about and read about in the previous episodes how Mark Barmore was shot in the back. We see here not only is everyone shot in the back, but they've upped the ante where Michael Sago Jr. was shot while he was in the back, while on his hands and knees and while crawling away. And the number one thing that is always used in these officer-involved shootings or in-custody deaths events is the safety of the police officer and the police officer being in fear of their life. And there's very rarely a deep conversation about how many times these police officers shoot and kill somebody in a situation where their lives are not in danger. Their lives are not threatened. And they shoot and kill somebody for doing something that if they were to arrest them for, they would not face capital punishment for in the court of law. Another thing that's very striking to me is how long it took for medical assistance to get to these young men, teenagers who have been shot that night. Marie's Pizza is directly across the street from Swedish American Hospital in Rockford, Illinois. And when you see or when you know how close in proximity the two are, to know that Michael Sago Jr. had time in which if he had life-saving treatment administered to him where he may have survived, and he could have survived that night. And I think that we have to want the survival and the growth and the evolution and the development of people who may engage in acts that we can't justify. Another thing at the very end of the passages that we read, it speaks about how Pobjecky never stated he was an officer that night. He never gave any commands. He was just shooting to kill. How he was the only person who did any shooting that night. And it would be a very quick turnaround investigation. Pobjecky would be justified. He would be the first person who was investigated by the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force after it was created when Mark Barmore was shot and killed. And he lays the groundwork and the foundation for the 100% rate that they have. 100% of officers who have been investigated have been justified. 100% of events that have been investigated have been justified. And so it's important when we're talking about all of these events being justified, when we're talking about the culture of impunity, that we trace back all the individual steps that we can. The events that took place around the killing of Michael Sago Jr. varied vastly from the events that took place around the shooting and killing of Mark Barmore, just like they vary vastly from the events that will take place around the shooting and killing of Philip Johnson, as we read about and learn about in our next episode. So we can't just simply speak about the isolated incidents, speak about individual actions that took place on these dates. We have to also combine that conversation with the root causes that led to these things happening, with the institutional wrongs, with the policies and procedures that are wrong, the legal things that are wrong in the system, with the values system that exists in a society. There has to be multiple layers of these conversations if we want to get to a place of making sure that these people have not been shot and killed in vain, that these families have not grieved in vain, that these cities and these areas that have struggled when these things have taken place across the country have not done so in vain. And we will only be divided and conquered if we allow ourselves to try to nitpick different things that happen when these officer-involved shootings take place. As it stands here in the United States of America, 3 times every day on average for the past decade, someone is shot and killed by law enforcement in this country. That averages up to more than 1,000 people a year. And if we nitpick who deserved to get shot and who didn't deserve to get shot, if we nitpick if somebody should have ran, if somebody shouldn't have had a knife, if somebody shouldn't have had a gun, we get to a place of being able to we get to a place where we will be divided against each other. And what we have to say is that if 3 times a day people are shot and killed in this country, then it is something that is much deeper than with what any individual is doing or even any individual officer is doing. It is about an institutional problem. It is about collective problems. And so it's going to take a collective understanding for us to be able to conquer those.